Good morning, Captain.
Hello, fellas. I understand you're ready to be checked out on the P-39. I see you've been reading over your pre-flight dope. That's the right idea. It's very important to have the technical orders covering the operation and first echelon maintenance well in mind before you take the plane off the ground for the first time. It should be thoroughly covered. Then, too, you should spend enough time in the cockpit to be certain you fully understand the instructions in the TO manual. In reading this material, you've probably learned a lot about the P-39. As you can see, it's a low-wing monoplane of the Interceptor Pursuit class, and it's designed to pack quite a wallop. It's equipped with a tricycle landing gear, which is retractable, but just forget that there are 3 wheels instead of 2. It handles much like any other plane. The Allison liquid-cooled engine is behind the pilot, and a drive shaft runs forward to a reduction gearbox, which drives the constant speed propeller. This arrangement makes possible the installation of a high-caliber automatic cannon along the thrust line. Some models have a 20-millimeter cannon, and others a 37-millimeter. In addition, there are 2 synchronized 50-caliber guns in the nose and 2 30-caliber guns in each wing panel. You have enough armament here to take care of yourself and make it uncomfortable for the enemy as well. The guns are charged from the cabin and are fired electrically. There is a gun selection panel in the cockpit where you can switch on any or all of the guns. On the stick, there's a trigger for the 30s and 50s and a separate button for the cannon. Considering the firepower the P-39 carries, the rate of climb is exceptional. Its critical altitude varies in the different models between 13,000 and about 17,500 feet. Absolute ceiling is from 32 to about 35,000 feet. The engine in the different models varies from 1,150 horsepower at sea level upward according to the rating of the particular engine. Cruising at 2,300 RPM and 30 inches of manifold pressure at an altitude of 5,000 feet gives approximately 250 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Stalling speed is about 95 miles an hour indicated, fully loaded and with the flaps down. She handles very well and responds nicely to the controls. The more detailed information you have from your reading and the thorough check of the cockpit, then you'll be ready to check out. Have any of you finished yet?
Yes, sir.
All right, Lieutenant, let's get started. Setting up on the wing, here's your hand grip, and be sure you don't step on the wing fillet. I see you know your parachutes, Lieutenant. Buckles properly attached, and the straps fit well. I guess you know that it pays to have your parachute right. Okay, climb in. Compact little office, isn't it? You'll find everything you need here, and all conveniently located. First, have a look at the rudder pedals to see if they're properly adjusted for you. Down on the side of the pedal, there's an adjustment with 5 positions. Press the lever with your toe and set the pedal to the length that's comfortable for you. And do the same on the other side, but be sure both pedals are set to the same position. You might look back at the rudder as a further check on this. And at the same time, try your controls to be sure of their operating sense. Check the rudder, the elevators, and your ailerons, too. Now, set your brakes. First, hold out the brake handle, there above the radio panel. Then press in on your brake pedal. Then release the handle. Now let's fasten your shoulder straps. This harness is for your safety, and it should be worn at all times. In the event of an emergency landing, it will prevent you from being thrown forward. The adjustable straps fasten to the seat belt buckle. Slide them on the catch, and the seat belt hook will hold them in place. The release fastens securely, and it can be opened in a jiffy, releasing both the shoulder straps and the seat belt. Down on your left is a knob which controls the shoulder harness lock. Pull it up and it releases the harness so that you can reach forward. Reset it and it locks the harness again. There's a top latch up here on each door. Keep it from being sucked outward at high speeds. Be sure they're both fastened securely before you take off. And be sure the door handle is in the closed position, that is, horizontal. And down here on either side, there's an emergency release for the doors. If you ever have to, pull that out, and the entire door will fall away. Give it a try. You don't have to undo the top latch to release the door, but you may have to nudge it with your elbow to jar it loose at low speeds. Both doors work in the same way. Here, let's plug in your radio connections. Just behind your right shoulder are the jacks for your throat mic and headset. Be sure they're securely fastened. Then over here on your right is the transmitter. You can send either CW or voice, and there's a selection switch for the 4 bands. When you want to transmit, press the button on the throttle. Down in front of you are the receiver controls. There are 3 of them for ground, interplane, or beam reception. On your right is a hand crank for manual operation of the landing gear should the electric drive fail. To use it, first turn the clutch selector rod to the manual position, that is, pointing aft. There's a ratchet fall on the crank for up and down operation. Normally, however, the gear is operated by means of the electric motor drive, and the clutch handle should be in this position. The switches for all electrical equipment are on the left side of the instrument panel. Be sure the landing gear switch is not in the up position. Check the gun switches to be sure they're all off before turning on the main battery switch. It's on the right side of the switch panel, and the generator switch is just below it. But you might try your flaps to be sure they're working properly. The first of the 3 travel indicators is for your flaps. The other 2 are landing gear. Aside from being used in landing, the flaps can also be used to shorten your takeoff run on a small field. For this, 1/4 flap should be used. However, I don't recommend that you use flaps for takeoff until you're more familiar with the plane. The propeller on this plane is an Aero Products propeller, which operates automatically. It changes pitch hydraulically by means of a cylinder in the propeller hub, and the only control is on the throttle quadrant. Some P-39s are equipped with Curtiss electric propellers. For these, there is a governor control on the throttle quadrant, similar to the other. In addition, there's a safety switch and a switch for automatic control. If automatic operation fails, there are manual increase and decrease positions on this switch. When you turned on the battery, it energized the fuel transmitter. Remember always to check the fuel in your tanks. Down on your left is a fuel selector valve, which makes it possible to draw fuel from 4 lines, 3 actual tanks. For takeoff and landing, always use the reserve tank, which is part of the left wing tank. In actual operation, the fuel is pumped from the tank to the selector valve, through which the fuel lines from all tanks pass. From the selector valve, the fuel flows to the strainer, where all foreign matter is filtered out. Then to the electrically driven booster pump, which replaces the old type wobble pump. It is used to pump fuel to the carburetor for starting the engine, at high altitudes to prevent vapor lock in event that proper fuel pressure cannot be maintained, or it can be used in case the engine-driven fuel pump fails. The fuel then goes to the engine-driven pump, which normally supplies sufficient pressure when the engine is in operation. From the fuel pump, the fuel continues on into the carburetor. In some models, there is a vapor eliminator system included here, and it is designed to overcome vapor lock. A red warning light on the instrument panel lights up when there is a drop in fuel pressure, such as is caused when a tank empties. There is a small tank unit in the system which can supply enough fuel to keep the engine going for 90 seconds, until you have had time enough to change to another tank. There is also a vapor return line through which vapor and excess raw gas from the carburetor flow back to the left tank at an appreciable rate. The reserve tank is really part of the left wing tank. Here there are 2 finger screens at the head of the 2 fuel lines which flow from the tank. The tall finger screen is for the left wing tank, and through this line you can draw the 40 gallons which are above the standpipe. Below this, the remaining 20 gallons, or a full tank of 60 gallons, can be drawn through the lower finger screen, which is the reserve tank. For long-distance flying, these planes can be equipped with a belly tank, varying in fuel capacity from 75 gallons upward. The tank is attached to the underside of the fuselage by means of sway braces, and it can be released during flight by pulling out on the bomb release handle in the cabin. With the fuel selector valve in the auxiliary tank position, fuel from this tank is drawn up into the selector valve and then through the same system that the fuel from the other tanks followed to the carburetor. When you change your selector valve to the right wing tank, you can draw 60 gallons. Just as in the other tanks, the fuel from here goes first through the selector valve and then through the rest of the system in the same way as did the others. Back of the trim tab controls is a carburetor heat control, which you will seldom have need for. Under extreme icing conditions, press the button to pull it out, and it will bring warm air from the engine compartment to the carburetor.
Well, now you've read all your pre-flight material and spent enough time in the cockpit to thoroughly familiarize yourself with all the controls and adjustments. Let's assume that you're taking her up for the first time.
First, you'd set your fuel selector valve to the reserve tank, where with full tank you have 60 gallons. Then on the throttle quadrant, be sure the mixture control is an idle cutoff. The prop governor is placed full forward to low pitch or high RPM, and the throttle is cracked open about 3/4 of an inch. On the side of the quadrant is a tension adjustment. Be sure you have a firm feel to all three of your controls to prevent them from creeping. Turn on the battery and generator. Then, to prime the engine, first crack the primer. Turn on the booster pump. Then pull out the primer so that it's filled. Turn off the pump and then push the primer in, locking it. In colder weather, you may have to do this 2 or 3 times. Then turn the ignition to both on. The inertia starter pedal is down on the right side. Press it back to energize. During the energizing operation, turn on the booster pump, which will bring your fuel pressure to about 13.5 pounds. When sufficiently energized, check to see that your prop is clear before pressing forward to engage. As soon as it coughs and catches, move the mixture control to automatic rich. Then turn off the booster pump long enough to be sure the engine-driven pump is operating. Oil pressure should be above 50 pounds and the oil temperature around 30 degrees before takeoff. During warm-up, the coolant temperature will rise more rapidly than the oil. On your right side are the controls for the coolant and oil shutters. Be sure they're open sufficiently. In warm weather like this, the coolant shutter should be opened all the way, while to keep the oil temperature even with the press zone, it need be opened only to the flush position. In colder weather, it would be almost fully closed. If everything is in good order and she's idling all right, you're about ready to taxi out to the runway. After calling the tower, be sure your doors are shut and latched. You'll be more comfortable with the windows fully closed. In this type cockpit, it isn't necessary to wear goggles. Then set your trim tabs. The recommended setting for the elevator is 3 or 4 graduations nose up, the rudder 4 graduations right rudder, and the aileron trim tabs 0 setting. Then release your brakes by depressing both brake pedals. For taxiing, you'll find that the P-39 requires only a small amount of throttle, between 1,000 and 1,200 RPM. To turn in close quarters or at slow speeds, you can get full swivel action in the nose wheel by the use of the main wheel brakes, and you'll be able to turn almost in your own span. To prevent overheating, don't delay in getting out to takeoff position for a final engine check. You'll find that the plane has very good taxiing characteristics and that the brakes are very effective. You can taxi downwind, crosswind, or in any direction very easily. It is unnecessary to ride the brakes. At the end of the runway, call the tower and advise them that you're about to complete your final warm-up and check-off before flight. Set your brakes for the rev-up, then advance the throttle. Be sure the various pressures are okay and your temperature is low enough. Be very careful not to overheat. Check the magnetos at 2,300 RPM. First, switch to right magneto, and the drop-off here should be maximum 100 RPM. Then switch to left, and the drop-off should be maximum 60 RPM. Then back to both, and the tack should climb back to 2,300. To be sure the prop governor is functioning properly, pull it back. There should be a drop in RPM. Then push it forward to full low pitch for takeoff. Check the ammeter to see that the generator is working. It cuts in between 1,300 and 1,400 RPM. Finally, to be sure that everything is in good order, there's a checklist provided on the instrument panel. Refer to it and go over everything once more. Are your fuel tanks full? Is the selector valve on reserve? Prop governor, full forward and automatic rich on mixture. Fuel pressure up to 14 to 15.5 pounds. Oil pressure up. Oil temperature okay. Coolant temperature okay. Suction up. And is your gearbox oil pressure okay? Now you're all set. Look around to be sure you're in the clear and then open your throttle smoothly. Remember that you have a lot of power pulling this plane and there'll be a lot of torque, so use full right rudder. You should have 3,000 RPM and 45.5 inches of manifold pressure. As you gather speed, it will feel like any conventional plane. However, avoid a long run. When you have sufficient speed, 100 miles per hour, pull back gently, and you'll lift off the ground quite suddenly. When you're safely off the ground, retract the landing gear. Keep an eye on the indicators to be sure they're coming up all right. When the wheels are fully retracted, the limit switches cut off the motor. The ammeter should drop back to normal. The landing gear indicators will be fully up, and you can turn the switch to neutral. When you're clear of all obstacles bordering the field and she feels all right, throttle back to normal climbing power, 37.5 inches of manifold pressure with the prop governor at 2,600 RPM. Your airspeed indicator should show about 160 miles per hour. No turns should be attempted at less than 150 miles per hour. As you change RPM and power and as your speed increases, you'll want to adjust your trim tab. During the climb, watch your operating temperature. At 160 miles per hour, your best climbing speed, cooling is the most critical. Be sure your coolant shutter is open sufficiently to keep the engine temperature down. When you reach a safe altitude, level off. Throttle back to 30 inches of manifold pressure and pull the prop governor back to 2280 RPM. Depending on the temperature of the air, the coolant shutter should be adjusted for proper cooling of the engine. In extremely hot weather or in tropical climates, they should be kept pretty well open, somewhere between flush and full open. You'll find that the P-39 has excellent visibility in all directions, forward, rearward, above, and on either side. Referring to the checklist once more, be sure that everything's functioning properly, that the fuel and oil pressures are up, and that the temperatures are right. Then, with everything operating smoothly, give some attention to the characteristics of your controls. You'll find that they are sensitive and respond nicely. Then try a few turns to see how she handles. With the landing gear and flaps retracted, try a stall. Ease back gently on the stick, keeping the nose slightly above the horizon. You'll find that in this condition, the stalling speed is about 105 miles per hour. Ease the stick forward, and be sure you build your airspeed up sufficiently to completely unstall your wing, at least 140 miles per hour before leveling off. Then take it back up to a safe altitude again and try another stall. Only this time have the landing gear and flaps extended. It'll give you a good chance to study the plane's stalling characteristics and the landing condition before you bring her in for the first time. Since you're going to extend your landing gear, you might try the manual operation. Be sure the landing gear electrical switch is in the neutral position, and then change the clutch handle to the manual position. To firmly engage it, switch the ratchet pawl to up and crank to retract the gear. This will bring the clutch handle fully to the manual position. Then change the pawl to down and start cranking. Because you'll be pulling against the pressure of the slipstream, keep your airspeed below 140 miles per hour so you won't have to put so much weight behind it. With your landing gear extended, lower your flaps and then try another stall. In this condition, you'll find that your stalling speed will be about 95 miles per hour. To retract the landing gear, change the clutch back to the electric position and retract the gear with the electric motor drive. Retract the flaps as well, but be sure you put the landing gear and flap switches back to the neutral position when they're fully retracted. You'll find that in either condition, the stall is gentle and there is no pronounced tendency for the plane to fall off on either wing. And now you should be pretty well acquainted with the basic handling qualities and general flight characteristics. Before shooting your first landing, you might give her the gun and see how she works. Now you've had a good workout and have gotten the feel of her pretty well. Let's bring her in for a landing. You might refer to your checklist again. You'll find it helpful. Switch the fuel selector valve to the reserve or right tank, depending upon which one has the most fuel, and throttle back to about 15 inches of manifold pressure. Push the prop governor up to about 2,600 RPM. When your airspeed has dropped to less than 200 miles per hour, the landing gear can be extended. Keep an eye on the indicators. When the wheels are fully extended, the pop-up indicator on the nose cowling and one in each wing panel will be visible. The travel indicator will be down and the ammeter should read normal. In making your approach, you'll find that with the P-39's excellent visibility in all directions, you will not have to make a close turn to keep track of other traffic in the air. You can come straight in if you want to. Keep your speed up sufficiently until you're beyond all obstacles bordering the airport. When your speed is about 140 miles per hour, lower the flaps. Glance at the indicator to be sure the flaps are full down. Use your elevator trim tab to lighten the stick forces due to the change in trim with the gear and flaps extended. Now remember, you'll be bringing this plane in for the first time. It's only natural that you won't be fully accustomed to it and perhaps a little uncertain. But don't forget your traffic regulations. Don't make a right turn instead of a left into the airport. Just take it easy and establish a steady glide. Be careful not to come in too fast. If you're not quite straight with the runway and you find that you're not going to be able to set her down on the first third of the runway, don't be afraid to take her around again. It's much better and safer to make a good landing on the second or even the third try than to bring her in for a bad landing the first time. In going around again, don't forget your flaps. On your next try, be careful to make a wide enough turn coming in so as not to crowd yourself. Get lined up with the runway early. Then you can concentrate on maintaining a proper approaching airspeed. Now your approach is steady and you're lined up with the runway, but you're still coming in a little too fast. You haven't broken your speed sufficiently to make a tail-low landing on the first third of the runway. You will land on 3 wheels, fast and a little rough. There's no great hazard coming in fast on three wheels, but it may be hard on the equipment, and it'll require either a very long landing run or excessive use of the brakes. Now let's try it once more, only a little slower this time. Continue in a normal gliding approach and forget that you have a tricycle landing gear. Make a conventional tail-low landing. It's practically impossible to get your tail low enough to drag it on the runway. It's for this reason that a tail skid is not installed. In slow motion, your landing should look something like this. You should contact the ground at about 95 miles per hour. Keep the stick well back and hold the nose wheel off the ground as long as possible. The plane will slow down quite rapidly in this attitude without the use of brakes. When you apply your brakes, the nose wheel will come down. There's absolutely no danger of nosing over no matter how hard you apply the brakes. However, the brakes are powerful enough to lock the main wheels and burn out a tire. Use them intermittently. When you taxi back from the runway, open your coolant shutters to keep the engine from overheating. Bring your flaps up, but remember the flaps, not your landing gear. Then bring her in and park her. To shut off the engine, pull the mixture control back to idle cutoff and advance your throttle slightly. When the engine is stopped, turn off your ignition switch, then your battery and generator switches. The flap and landing gear switches should be put in the neutral position. Then turn off your radio receiver and transmitter.
Well, that's the story, Lieutenant. She's all yours.
Just remember, fellows, this plane handles much like any other. It's not a hot landing ship, but it is fast, and it may respond a little quicker than you're accustomed to. Just take it easy until you get the feel of the controls. You'll find that you'll get along very well together. As a team, you and this plane have an important job to do in winning this war.
This is Chuck Randall. He's training to be a fighter pilot and has about 40 hours in the P-39. Knows the airplane pretty well, too. He's not the hottest pilot in the world, but conscientious. He'll make a good flyer. Here's another of the boys. He has about as much time as Chuck, but a little different approach to his flying. For one thing, he didn't spend much time getting to know his airplane. It finally caught up with him. Coming in one day, his battery went out when the gear was only part way down. It was a funny thing, too, because the battery and generator had just been checked. Well, it meant emergency operation of the gear. He went through all the motions. It didn't feel right at all. It cranked much too easily. It didn't seem to be engaging. Reason? Well, he didn't wait to find out. He had other plans. Sure, it was a safe landing. He didn't have a scratch. But it was a pretty sad-looking airplane. He didn't look too happy himself, and with good reason. In the first place, if he'd had the clutch handle to manual, he could have cranked the gear down without any trouble. In the second place, if he needed help remembering emergency operation, there's a card of instructions on the door. In the third place, if the generator had been on, the battery wouldn't have gone dead in the first place. The moral of that story is, know the airplane you are about to pilot. Now, flying the P-39 is not a lot different from the advanced trainers you've been flying. It has more power, it's faster, and it's very light on the controls. But just as with any new airplane, the more you know about it, the better you'll fly it. Much of the information you need, you'll get from your instructor. Some of it you'll get from talking it over with other men who are in training with you. But the best reference guide is your own experience. It's something you'll always have with you. So keep it up to date. Well, now let's start at the beginning with Chuck and see what he found out. What do you say, Chuck?
Okay, sir. Well, after the tech orders and a thorough check of the cockpit, I was ready to give it a try. With the tail in the air, I could see where I was going without Essing. She taxied very easily with short bursts on the throttle, and I let her coast a lot. Didn't have to use much brake. Getting her in the air was all right. As a matter of fact, it was fun. I'd never flown that much power before, and I was surprised how easily she handled. But I hadn't never landed a tricycle gear job before either, so I guess I was a little uncertain about bringing her in. I could see I was coming in pretty fast, and there wasn't going to be enough runway. So I gunned her to go around again. I knew the fellows were watching, but I figured I could live that down easier than messing up a nice new airplane. Then I brought it in again. Landing instructions said it was just like landing any other airplane, and I took them at their word. I rolled out of the turn at about 140, lowered my flaps, and established a steady glide at about 130. This is how it looks to the slow-motion camera. I came in over the end of the runway at 110, leveled out and got the airplane in a conventional three-point landing attitude. I set it down on the two main wheels, holding the nose wheel off the ground with a slight back pressure on the stick. I found that I could hold the nose wheel anywhere from a few inches to 2 feet off the ground and still make a good landing. The airplane rolled straight down the runway, and I applied the brakes intermittently to lose speed. We don't roll up the flaps here until we park, since there are no stones to damage them, and there's less chance of hitting the wrong switch.
How was the first flight, Chuck? Have any trouble?
No, sir, it was okay. It was a lot different from what I expected. I guess you can't believe everything you hear.
Depends where you hear it. You can pick up a lot of information from hangar experts, all the free dope you'll want on any airplane, and they always have it on good authority. Well, to get on with Chuck's story, he was over the first hump, but that was only the beginning. He still had a few things to learn about flying the airplane. And aside from the cockpit, there was a lot he wanted to know about the airplane itself. It's good background. Might come in handy someday.
I was going into my transitional training, which began with 8 engineering missions designed to get me acquainted with the performance of the airplane and the operation of its engine. I was flying a Model N airplane and knew from the tech orders that if necessary, I could take off with 52 inches and 3,000 RPM, which is rated takeoff power. But in training, with the airplane making 8 or 10 takeoffs a day, we're instructed to keep it down to something less. Actually, it's possible to take off with as little as 35 inches. When I had sufficient altitude, I retracted the gear, and when I was up to a few hundred feet, eased back to 35 inches and 2,600. The going was smooth, and it sure felt good to be flying again. But I wasn't ready just yet to sit back and enjoy the scenery. There were a couple of things I had to keep an eye on. The press-stone temperature was under control. Oil temperature was about 70 degrees. Okay. Oil pressure about 70. Fuel pressure, okay. And I had enough airspeed, which is always a good thing to know. They say altitude is like money in the bank, and it's one thing the government has no objection to hoarding. Besides, when you're new to an airplane, it's an especially good idea to have plenty of space underneath you. I was on my way up to 10,000 feet. When I got there, I settled back and tried a few coordination exercises. In rolling into a turn, I found that very little rudder pressure was needed. You want to treat this airplane like a lady. Don't try to be fast or rough if you expect to get along with her. Then I tried a few gentle turns. At first, I had a tendency to skid or slip. The turning radius of this airplane is much greater than what I'd been used to. It took me a while to get the proper relationship between the aileron and rudder. But by doing a few more and keeping an eye on the bank and turn indicator, I soon got the idea of how to coordinate properly, and they began to feel pretty smooth. Like all pilots who fly pursuit, it wasn't long before I got to wondering about the speed I could get out of her. So I poured on Nicole to see how she'd react. Up to 3,000 RPM and 52 inches. Incidentally, the tech orders say always increase RPM first, then manifold pressure. It's especially important in a high-powered engine like this. If you don't, you'll be building up excess pressure inside the cylinders, and it's liable to detonate and cause serious damage to the engine. With the increased power, temperatures and pressures went up, and I adjusted the shutters. 5 minutes is the maximum time for operation with this power, but I think you can find out what you want to know in less time than that. At least I did. I tried various combinations of mixture, RPM, and manifold pressure at different altitudes to get some idea of how these factors affected power. In my first mission, I tried a few partial stalls with the gear and flaps retracted. I don't quite know what I expected, but I was pleasantly surprised. The airplane stalled very gently and had no tendency to drop a wing. There was plenty of warning before she stalled completely. Later, I carried this a little further and did a complete stall at 10,000 feet with the power partially off. That is about 15 inches. It broke clean at about 100, and to recover, I dropped the nose to let her pick up speed, about 180, before I started to pull her up. As the stall was explained to me, it's all a matter of airflow over the wing's surface. If the airflow is disturbed due to an increased angle of attack, the wing loses its lift and the airplane will stall.
When the airplane approaches a stall, turbulence begins at the roots. And as this section begins to stall, it causes a shuddering. The tail buffets slightly from the effect of this turbulent air. The stall progresses outboard and gradually affects aileron control. Just before the stall is complete, the entire aileron becomes ineffective. In recovery, the ailerons regain control before the wing is completely unstalled. So when you first feel aileron control returning, don't let it fool you. Don't start to pull up until you have sufficient speed.
Later, I tried some partial stalls with the gear and flaps extended. The stall characteristics were pretty much the same as in the clean condition, but with the stall occurring at a lower speed. With the power reduced, I pulled the stick back gently until gradually the stall point was reached. After she began to shudder slightly, at about 95, I eased gently forward on the stick. I let her pick up some speed in a shallow dive, about 140, and eased her back level. Knowing stalls is a pretty good way to get the feel of any airplane. So I practiced until I was sure of it. Then, with the gear still down, I trimmed the airplane for an indicated airspeed of 150 and tried some gliding turns for practice and landing approaches. I figured it'd be a good idea to try them first at a safe altitude where there were no traffic problems, and I could concentrate on getting the knack of a properly coordinated gliding turn. I knew that speed was important, and I didn't let it drop below 130. At first, I'd go beyond a medium bank. A steeper bank is all right, but it's easy to skid, and I wanted to be darn sure I didn't pull her in too tight. It wasn't long before I was ready to hang one on the beginning of a landing. I kept some power on and didn't cut the gun until after the turn. I could spot my landings pretty well now. Whatever uncertainties I'd had at first were cleared up after I'd made a few more. Another day, I gave some attention to climbing. With normal climbing power, 2,639 inches, she indicated 160, which is the best climbing speed. Compared to the trainers I'd flown before, this baby really climbed. At 12,000 feet, I put her in a dive. I'd tried a few before, and this time I wanted to get up to 400. I hadn't trimmed for the dive, and I found that I needed left rudder and some forward stick pressure to follow a straight flight path. At about 7,000 feet, I started to pull out very gradually. It didn't matter so much how fast I was traveling, just so I took it easy in the pullout. In a dive, the greater the speed, the more gradual the pullout has to be. I still had a lot to learn about the airplane, and flying tight turns was a good way to do it. It helps to develop the feeling for the airplane, which is so necessary for combat flying. It's important to be in full control at all times, and so it meant working up to them gradually. As I went along, I reefed them in tighter, and pretty soon was pulling them in almost to the stall point. I was making the turns as tight as I could without stalling out. There was a definite change in the feel of the controls just preceding the stalling conditions. I could feel a buffeting on the tail, and the whole airplane shuddered. I got so I could recognize it and was able to prevent a stall by relaxing back pressure. Occasionally, I'd let her stall some, but it was easy enough to recover. The airplane unstalled quickly, and full control returned immediately. The speed didn't matter so much as the tightness of turn. The tighter the turn, the higher the speed at which I stalled out. I practiced tight turns on a number of missions and got to be pretty sure of myself, and probably a little careless. Because during one, I guess I must have pulled her in a little too tight. The airplane stalled, and I didn't relax back pressure quick enough, and I spun out of the inside of the turn. It caught me unawares, and it must have been a couple of turns before I started to recover. She responded promptly. I decided to check up on spins, and this is what my instructor had to say.
In this airplane, a spin is an irregular gyration going first slow and then fast in an oscillatory pattern. The first move, when you're aware you're in a spin, is to close the throttle and go into low RPM. As soon as the direction of rotation is established, bring the stick full back, apply full rudder with the spin, and hold until ready to recover. When the airplane comes to the slow part of its gyration, apply hard opposite rudder. A moment later, move the stick full forward and apply ailerons against the spin. As soon as the rotation stops, usually about 3/4 of a turn, it'll begin to recover in a steep dive. Neutralize all controls and wait until the airplane picks up speed and feels normal. Then gradually start to pull up, and recovery is completed. In the P-39, as in most airplanes, a spin is easily and quickly recovered from, if not permitted to progress too far.
I was familiar with the feel of the basic maneuvers and could coordinate each of them pretty well. Next, it was a matter of combining them, and the Lazy 8 was a good way to do it. It's a valuable maneuver for developing coordination, since it involves motion about all three axes of the airplane at the same time and through a wide range of speeds. I started them from cruising, pulling up in a bank not more than 70 degrees at the steepest point, with a minimum airspeed of 160 at the top of the arc and not exceeding 300 at the center of the 8. When I could do a good job of these, I felt I was well on my way to mastering the airplane. Next came the two-plane element, flying with my instructor. We talked it over first on the ground and checked on signals. We took off individually and got into formation in a gentle turn. In loose formation, we climbed to a safe altitude. At 10,000 feet, I trimmed out the ship and pulled up into formation on signal. Keeping it fairly loose, we tried some gentle turns. I was flying on the inside and found that at first I had a tendency to over-control. But brushing up on the old fundamentals of position, distance, and smooth throttle coordination, it wasn't long before I could do a fairly decent job of following around in a turn. Actually, with the additional power and increased speed range of the airplane, I found it was easier to fly good formation in the P-39 than in the training airplanes I'd flown before. Then we tried some climbs. It was good practice for coordinating my speed and throttle settings with the leaders. And then some dives. Pretty gentle at first, and then steeper. I was becoming accustomed to flying formation at higher speeds and in sharper maneuvers. With several two-plane missions behind me, I felt pretty much at home in formation. I hadn't done much in the way of acrobatics in the airplane and felt about ready for it. Double-checking my shoulder harness lock, I tried some rolls. Starting at cruising, it rolled very easily and had a good response to the ailerons. The stick pressures generally were much lighter than I'd been accustomed to, and she responded quickly and smoothly. Although a pretty easy maneuver, it sure built up my confidence. Then came loops. During this maneuver, the airplane flies through two speed extremes, high at the beginning and end, and low at the top. Trimmed for cruising, I applied left rudder as I pulled up. As the speed decreased, I relaxed rudder pressure. As the airplane continued up, I applied right rudder. On the downward arc, as the speed increased beyond cruising, I relaxed right and gradually applied left rudder. Straight back on the stick fairly hard so as to maintain sufficient speed to carry me through at the top. Nearing the inverted position, I relaxed back pressure slightly and stretched my neck backward as far as possible to see the horizon when it appeared. I could use it as a reference in keeping my wings level. Then on down and around. After more acrobatic practice, I felt I could handle the airplane in all attitudes and was confident in trying my hand at more advanced maneuvers. Something my instructor said helped.
With proper instruction, you should feel no apprehension about attempting almost any maneuver. And you'll find that very often fear of the unknown is removed by deliberately doing what you're afraid will happen.
All my training thus far had pointed toward one thing, and now I was ready for it. Gunnery. These planes are built around their armament and are equipped to deliver a lot of firepower. First, I tried my hand at ground targets. With fixed guns aimed to fire along the axis of the airplane, I knew the projectile would strike the target only if I were flying a straight, true course. It meant having the ball in the center. With the ship in a skid, there was a horizontal component, and I hit to one side of the target. And the speed I was traveling at was important, too. Below the recommended speed, the airplane was inclined above the flight path. At higher speeds, it was inclined below the flight path, introducing a vertical component. I started at 2,000 or 3,000 feet in a steep dive and flattened out to make an approach at 15 to 25 degrees to the horizon. I found I could come down pretty close and still not have to pull out steeply or abruptly. Next came water targets, and here I had to be even more careful in my pullouts. I didn't hit very much at first, but I was told not to be too concerned. Accurate judgment of speed and timing in pullouts can only be attained with many practice runs. Since this airplane has proved an effective weapon for attacking ground objectives, my training included low-altitude flying and simulated strafing. Then came deflection gunnery practice on aerial targets, making dry passes at another ship. I started with a small amount of deflection, turning to keep lead on the target. Gradually, I increased the speed and narrowed the angle. And it soon became evident that my practice in tight turns was time well spent. Just lately, I've been practicing with live ammunition on a towed sleeve, which brings me pretty well up to date. As a matter of fact, I'm due for a mission right now. So long, fellas. See you around.
Thanks, Chuck. You men going into training in this airplane will probably cover much the same ground, perhaps in much the same way. You'll be flying an airplane which is fast and powerful. It is sensitive to the controls and quick to respond. Know thoroughly its characteristics, and when you join the men now in combat, your job will be easier, and like theirs, well done. For in the various war theaters, the record shows that when American fighting men in fighting airplanes set out for an enemy objective, the report is sure to be mission accomplished.